There is a building in Austin, Texas, that the state of Texas never paid for. It stands 311 feet from the ground to the star held up by the Goddess of Liberty, taller than the national Capitol in Washington. Its walls are sunset red granite, quarried from a single mountain in the hill country. When it was dedicated in May of 1888, it was one of the largest buildings in the United States, and by some measures, the largest state capitol ever constructed. It cost somewhere north of $3 million to build. The Texas Treasury contributed almost none of it. There is a receipt for that building. It is not written in dollars, it is written in acres, 3,050,000 of them in the far northwest corner of the state, in a strip of land roughly 200 miles long and 27 miles wide at its widest point. The men who accepted that trade did something with the land that had never been done before and has never been done since. They fenced it, all of it. 6,000 miles of barbed wire strung across 10 counties, enclosing the largest single fenced range in the world. Inside it, they put 150,000 cattle, 1,000 horses, 150 men, and 335 windmills, because on the surface of that country, there was almost no water at all. They branded everything with 3 letters, XIT, and then, inside a single working lifetime, it was gone. Not seized, not foreclosed, not burned out or bought out or lost in court. The largest ranch on earth simply came apart, piece by piece, and the men taking it apart were the same men who had built it. That is the strange thing about the XIT, and it is where this investigation has to begin. Because when an empire that size collapses, you expect to find a disaster, a drought, a crash, a villain. What you find instead is a plan. To understand why Texas paid for a building with dirt, you have to understand something unusual about how Texas joined the United States. When Texas was annexed in 1845, it came in as a former republic, and it kept 2 things most states never had: its own public debt and its own public lands. Every other state's unclaimed territory belonged to the federal government. Texas kept its own, tens of millions of acres of it. The consequence shaped Texas politics for a century. The state was permanently short of cash and permanently oversupplied with land. So land became money. Land paid for railroads, land paid for schools, land paid for veterans. In 1879, the legislature decided land would pay for a new Capitol building and set aside 3 million acres in the Panhandle to fund it. Note the date, 1879, 2 years before anything went wrong. Then, on the 9th of November, 1881, the old limestone Capitol in Austin caught fire and burned. What had been a long-term aspiration became an emergency. Texas now needed a Capitol immediately and had no money to build one. And the mechanism was already sitting on the books. The land itself was the part nobody argued about. It sat in the northwest Panhandle, on the high tableland the Spanish had called the Llano Estacado, spread across 10 counties: Dallam, Sherman, Hartley, Oldham, Deaf Smith, Palmer, Castro, Bailey, Lamb, Hockley. It had no timber, no navigable river, no town. Federal maps had labeled that whole region the Great American Desert, and the men in Austin were essentially spending an asset they believed was worth about 50 cents an acre and possibly less. This deserves a pause because the land had only just become available to spend. 5 years earlier, that country had not belonged to Texas in any practical sense. It belonged to the Comanche and the Kiowa, and it had for generations. The Red River War of 1874 and 1875 drove them out of the Panhandle and onto reservations in Indian Territory. In roughly the same window, commercial hunters removed the southern buffalo herd. Millions of animals reduced to bone piles in the space of about 4 years. So the asset the legislature was casually signing away in 1879 had been emptied of its people and its animals within the previous half-decade. The Panhandle wasn't unoccupied land that Texas happened to own. It was newly cleared land that Texas had just finished acquiring, which raises the question that drives everything that follows. If this land was worthless, a desert, a leftover, a bookkeeping entry, who on earth would agree to build a $3 million capital in exchange for it? The winning bid came from an Illinois contractor named Matthias Schnell of Rock Island. Within months of signing, Schnell transferred 3/4 of his interest to a Chicago partnership, Taylor, Babcock and Company. The partners were Abner Taylor, Amos C. Babcock, and two brothers named Farwell, John V. Farwell and Charles B. Farwell, who would later serve in the United States Senate. None of them were ranchers. The Farwells were dry goods merchants. John V. Farwell had built one of the largest wholesale houses in Chicago. These were men who understood inventory, credit, and margins. And what they saw in 3 million Panhandle acres was not grass. It was farms. The arithmetic was simple enough to fit on a card. They were acquiring land at an effective cost of roughly $1 an acre. Farmland in Illinois and Iowa was selling for 20, 30, 40. The American frontier was moving west at a predictable rate, and when it arrived, the Panhandle would be worth many times what they were paying. The capital was not the deal. The capital was the price of admission to the deal. There was only one flaw, and it was a serious one: timing. There were no settlers on the Llano Estacado in 1882. There was no railroad within 100 miles. There was no town, no bank, no market, no water development. By the syndicate's own estimates, the land would not be sellable at farm prices for 15 or 20 years. Meanwhile, the building had to go up now, and it was getting more expensive by the month. The original design called for Texas limestone. The stone came out of the quarry streaked and discolored, and the contractors switched to granite from Granite Mountain near Marble Falls. The owners donated the granite, but granite has to be moved, so a railroad spur had to be built to haul it. Convicts were put to work in the quarry to hold labor costs down. The granite cutters union boycotted the job, so the contractors imported Scottish stonecutters and were prosecuted under federal contract labor law for doing it. The building that cost Texas nothing was costing somebody a great deal. By 1885, the syndicate needed capital it did not have, and it went where large capital lived, not New York, London. The Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company Limited was chartered in London in 1885 and raised roughly $5 million against the Texas land. Its investors included British peers and financiers, men who had never seen the Panhandle and never would. Sit with that arrangement for a moment. The Texas State Capitol, the emblem of Texas sovereignty, the largest such building in America, was financed by British bondholders, secured against land taken from the Comanche a decade earlier, and it would have to be repaid by whatever that land could earn while it waited for farmers who did not yet exist, which meant the syndicate now needed the land to generate income during the wait. And there was exactly one thing 3 million acres of unbroken shortgrass could do. In the summer of 1885, a trail boss named Ab Blocker brought the first herd north to a place called Buffalo Springs in Dallam County at the top of the Panhandle. Roughly 2,500 head, the XIT was open for business. It needed a brand, and the story that survives is that Blocker himself scratched it into the dirt. Ask most people in Texas what XIT stands for, and they will tell you 10 in Texas, 10 counties, 1 state. It's a fine story. It is also almost certainly a story invented afterward, because the actual reason for those three letters had nothing to do with geography. XIT was chosen because it could be burned with 5 strokes of a single straight iron, and because it was nearly impossible for a rustler to alter. Most brands could be modified with a running iron. A curve added here, a bar extended there, and a stolen calf became legally somebody else's property. XIT resisted that. That detail matters more than it appears. The very first design decision of the largest ranch in the world was a defensive one. Before a single mile of fence went up, the men running the XIT had already concluded that their most dangerous problem would not be weather or markets. It would be people. The fencing began almost immediately, and it never really stopped. By the time it was finished, the XIT was wrapped and subdivided by roughly 6,000 miles of barbed wire, enough laid end to end to reach from Texas to London and a good distance back. The perimeter alone ran for hundreds of miles. Inside, the ranch was cut into 8 divisions, each with its own headquarters, its own foreman, its own crew. Each, in practice, a large ranch in itself. Buffalo Springs in the north, Escarbada on the New Mexico line, Spring Lake, Bovina, yellow houses at the southern end, nearly 200 miles from the top. The hardest problem was water. On the Llano Estacado, surface water is a rumor. So the XIT drilled, and when it hit water, it put a windmill on top, eventually more than 300 of them, and built hundreds of earthen dams to catch what little rain fell. Water dictated where cattle could graze, which dictated where fences went, which dictated how the entire enterprise was shaped. By the early 1890s, the numbers had reached their peak. About 150,000 cattle, more than 1,000 horses, roughly 150 men on the payroll. Look at what has actually been built here. Fixed capital, fencing, water infrastructure, division management, payroll, standardized equipment. This was not a ranch in the way the word was understood in 1885. It was a factory that happened to run on grass, and it was owned by a corporation in London. And factories require something the cattle country had never had. The XIT's first general manager was a Kansas cattleman named B.H. Campbell, universally known as Barbecue Campbell, after the shape of his own brand. Campbell had a problem no one had faced before. He needed to hire, almost overnight, enough men to work 3 million acres. He hired fast, and he did not ask many questions, and the results were what you would expect. The XIT filled up with men who had reasons for being difficult to find. Cattle disappeared. Some of the disappearing was done by outsiders. A great deal of it was not. By 1887, the syndicate had seen enough. Campbell was pushed out. The company's attorney, A.L. Matlock, was sent in to clean house, and a former Confederate officer named Albert Grigsby Boyce took over as general manager. A man with a reputation for discipline rather than charm. In 1888, the XIT issued a document that tells you more about what the American West was becoming than almost anything else from that decade. 23 general rules for employees. No gambling, no card playing, no drinking, no employee to carry a 6-shooter, no employee to kill ranch beef without permission, no hurrahing of visitors, rules governing conduct toward neighboring ranches, toward strangers, toward company property, toward company time. Consider what that piece of paper does. It takes the cowboy, by 1888 already a figure in dime novels, already a symbol of a man who answers to nobody, and converts him into a wage employee with a written code of conduct, earning $25 to $30 a month, working under a foreman who reports to a division manager, who reports to a general manager, who reports to a board of directors in London. The mythology of the free cowboy was being manufactured in the East at precisely the moment the largest cattle operation in the world was systematically eliminating the conditions that produced him. And it wasn't malice or nostalgia that did it. It was scale. You cannot run 3 million acres on handshakes. The rules worked. Order returned to the XIT. Rustling fell. The divisions ran efficiently. But discipline is not profit. And something had begun to show up in the company's books that no amount of order could fix. The XIT was born into the worst possible decade to be in the cattle business. The terrible winter of 1886 and 1887 killed livestock across the plains in numbers that broke ranches from Texas to Montana. Cattle prices sagged and then collapsed with the panic of 1893. And the panhandle grass itself was a hard master. Short grass country carries fewer animals per acre than anyone from the eastern states expects, and in drought years, it carries almost none. Then there was the deeper problem, the one the syndicate could not solve with better management. Steers raised on the high plains did not finish well. They came off that grass lean, and lean cattle brought poor prices in Chicago. The XIT's answer was extraordinary, and it should be read as a confession. Around 1889, the company leased some 2 million acres of range in Montana along the Yellowstone and began trailing roughly 12,000 steers a year north out of Texas to be fattened on better grass before sale. They did this for well over a decade. An enterprise that has to move its product 1,000 miles before it becomes worth selling is not a healthy business. It is a business looking for a reason to exist. And year after year, the money the cattle brought in did not cover what the company owed its bondholders. Here is where this investigation turns, so it is worth stopping. Read the name on the charter again, not the XIT Cattle Company. The Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company. The cattle were never the enterprise. The cattle were what the grass could earn, while the land waited for its real buyer. Every mile of fence, every windmill, every rule in that book of 23, all of it existed to keep an asset intact and defensible until the day it could be sold to somebody else. Which means the correct question was never why did the XIT fail? It was, what was the XIT waiting for? It arrived on iron rails at the very end of the century. In 1898, the railroad reached the Panhandle, running west through the heart of the XIT toward New Mexico, and the 15 to 20 year wait the Chicago men had calculated in 1882 turned out to have been almost exactly right. The company understood immediately what to do. It did not simply sell land. It manufactured the conditions that made land sellable. It platted town sites on its own property along the tracks, Bovina, Farwell on the state line, Channing, where the ranch put its headquarters. In 1901, at a rail junction in the northern divisions, a town called Dalhart was laid out on XIT ground. Every town made the sections around it worth more. Every depot turned grass into real estate. The first great sale came in 1901, and it came to a man who understood exactly what he was buying. George W. Littlefield, Confederate veteran, Austin banker, cattleman, purchased the Yellow House division at the far southern end of the ranch, roughly 312,000 acres, at about $2 an acre. Years later, he would plat a town on part of it and give it his own name. Then the machinery started in earnest. The company hired land agents. It ran excursion trains carrying prospective buyers out of Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa. It established demonstration farms to prove the country would grow crops. It advertised the Panhandle as the last cheap, good land in America. And the prices moved $2 an acre, then $5, then $10, then $20 and beyond as the wheat years came on. Each sale did two things at once. It made the company money and it made the ranch smaller. By 1912, the XIT sold the last of its cattle and went out of the livestock business entirely. 27 years. That was the entire working life of the largest fenced ranch in the world. Shorter than a mortgage, shorter than a career. And it did not end in failure. It ended in the successful execution of a plan drawn up before the first steer ever crossed the property line. The XIT's fall was its business model. The fences came down because the fences had done their job. But there is a second half to this, and it is the part the excursion brochures never mentioned. The company had spent 27 years learning something specific and expensive about that country. It sold the land anyway, without passing the lesson on. The XIT's own history was a detailed record of how difficult the high plains were. It had taken 300 windmills to find water. It had taken hundreds of dams to hold it. It had taken 2 million leased acres in Montana to make the cattle marketable. The company had learned at enormous cost that this land could be used, but not easily and only at scale. The people buying it in quarter sections were told something else, that with the right methods, rainfall would follow the plow. Then came the First World War, and wheat prices went up like a signal flare. And then came the tractor, which meant a single family could break more sod in a season than a dozen men with horses. Across the old XIT counties and the plains around them, millions of acres of short grass, sod that had never in recorded history been turned, went under the plow. Nobody was thinking about roots. The grass of the Llano Estacado had a root system built over thousands of years to hold thin soil in place through drought and 40-mile winds. It was functionally the only thing keeping the ground on the ground. The drought started around 1930. By 1932, the wind was carrying topsoil. By 1934 and 1935, it was carrying it in clouds thousands of feet high, black at midday, drifting soil against fence lines until the wire disappeared. And the town that became one of the emblems of the Dust Bowl was Dalhart, platted by the Capital Freehold Land, an investment company on XIT Range, in 1901. Dalhart's newspaper editor, John L. McCarty, founded the Last Man Club, whose members pledged never to abandon the country no matter what the sky did. Land that had sold for $25 an acre in the wheat years could not be given away. Families who had bought a piece of the largest ranch in the world walked off it. The XIT's greatest lesson had been a warning about the limits of that country. It had been marketed as an opportunity. There is one more piece, and it was sitting in plain view the entire time. Those 335 windmills had been drawing water from something. Nobody in 1890 understood what. Beneath the Llano Estacado lies the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest bodies of groundwater on Earth, water laid down over geological time, effectively not replenished on any human schedule. The XIT scratched the top of it with wind power and thought of it as a solution to a cattle problem. After the Second World War, deep turbine pumps, cheap natural gas, and eventually center pivot irrigation reached the plains, and the country that had beaten the Comanches buffalo hunters, the Chicago Syndicate, the British bondholders, and the dryland wheat farmers became one of the most productive agricultural regions in the United States. Cotton, corn, grain, sorghum, feedlots, dairies, land the Texas legislature had priced at roughly 50 cents an acre in 1879 came to be worth thousands. In 1963, the last tract of the old capital lands was sold. 84 years after the legislature set them aside, the transaction that built the Texas Capitol was finally completely closed, and the source of all that value the water is finite and is being drawn down in much of the region faster than anything replaces it. Parts of the aquifer that supported irrigation for decades no longer will, which produces the final pattern, the one that took a century to become visible. This country has always been made valuable by spending something that cannot be replaced. The buffalo, the grass, now the water underneath. The building is still there. It has been in continuous use since 1888, the largest state capitol in the country. Red granite, taller than the one in Washington. Millions of people have walked through it. Almost none of them know that the state of Texas never wrote a check for it. 200 miles of the Panhandle paid for it instead, and for 27 years, those acres were something the world had never seen. 3 million contiguous acres under one brand, wrapped in 6,000 miles of wire, staffed by cowboys with a written code of conduct, owned by shareholders in London, worked to make interest payments on a building in Austin. Every August, the town of Dalhart holds the XIT reunion, a rodeo and a free barbecue on ground that was once the ranch's northern range. It has been held since 1936, which is to say it began in the middle of the dust, 24 years after the last XIT steer was sold. The ranch has now been commemorated for far longer than it existed. So why did America's largest ranch rise and fall so quickly? Because it was never built to last. It was built to hold. A state with no money and a burned capital paid a Chicago syndicate in land. The syndicate mortgaged that land in London. London had to be repaid, and the only thing the land could produce in the meantime was cattle. So the cattle came, 150,000 of them, and the fences went up, and the rules were written, and the windmills turned, and all of it was a very expensive way of keeping an asset intact until a railroad arrived and made it worth selling. The moment that happened, there was no reason on earth to keep it. The XIT did not collapse. It was liquidated exactly as intended by the men who built it, and the fall was written into the founding documents years before the first herd ever crossed the line at Buffalo Springs. The largest ranch in the world was never really a ranch. It was a receipt, and receipts get paid.